Good evening, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd, Director of Programs with the Tenement Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our Tenement Talk featuring Professor Kent Blansett and the stories of his latest book, A Journey to Freedom. We're so glad you joined us. We're honored to be co-sponsoring this program with the American Indian Community House, an organization that works to support the needs of Native Americans residing in today's New York City. We're also partnering with an independent bookseller tonight, Books Are Magic, in the Cobble Hill neighborhood of Brooklyn, where you can purchase A Journey to Freedom from their online shop. If you are able, we encourage you to contribute to the Mannahatta Fund, through which donations will go directly to American Indian Community House. The Mannahatta Fund presents an opportunity for all settlers to support Indigenous peoples, such as the Lenni Lenape, who were forcefully displaced by European settlers and their descendants to create New York City and the United States. We hope you'll consider contributing, and we look forward to your participation in the conversation this evening. It's my honor to be here tonight with Akwesasne Oakes, Executive Director of the American Indian Community House, who will now introduce Professor Blansett and get our event started. So Akwesasne, welcome.
Sego. Thank you for having me. So Kent Blansett is a Cherokee Creek, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Potawatomi descendant from the Blanket, Panther, and Smith families. He is the Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History at the University of Kansas. Professor Blansett also serves as the founder and executive director of the American Indian Digital History Project. His latest book, A Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement, is the first biography to explore the dynamic life and times of Akwesasne Mohawk student leader Richard Oakes, who was a key figure in the 1969 takeover of Alcatraz Island by the organization Indians of All Tribes. Published by Yale University Press in newly released paperback edition for 2020, Blansett's book has garnered a national attention with reviews in the Los Angeles Times, a feature on NPR's Latino USA, and was recently optioned for a future movie. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. If you'll pause with me for just a little bit, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the American Indian Community House, as well as the Tenement Museum and Books Are Magic, for inviting me to present a talk based upon my book, Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement. My biography of Oakes strives to expand our historical understanding of this pivotal Native leader, as well as his times. For Oakes and his generation, the word freedom served to dismantle the colonial apparatus. It also served as a necessary disruption and a rejection of all systems that perpetuated Indigenous oppression within the United States. Now, tonight, we will explore the complex life and times of Richard Oakes. We'll start with his earliest years and we'll go all the way up until his assassination in 1972. As a roadmap, we'll start with his birth at Akwesasne. We'll explore the advent of an Indian city or Mohawk city in Brooklyn, New York. We'll follow his migration from Brooklyn all the way to San Francisco. And then we'll dive into activism at Alcatraz, Fort Lawton, and Pitt River takeovers and conclude with his legacy. So what follows and what you're about to hear is a story that has never been told until today. So where we start with Richard Oakes is he was born on May 22nd, 1942. He was born shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was brought up at St. Regis, or better known as Akwesasne, which straddles the border between the United States and Canada and is located in Upper New York. It is a very interesting place. Richard Oakes once called this place, it's 6 miles square with 3,000 people and 3,000 problems. I think what Richard Oakes was really meaning when he made this quote was he was talking about the rich political complexities that exist at Akwesasne. Because on the Canadian side, it is a reserve that's brought together with the Indian Act of 1876, in which there's a band council on the Canadian side. You have 2 provinces that are also bisecting the reservation. So the province of Ontario and the province of Quebec. So each of those has their own band councils. Then you have the Akwesasne side on the US side, which is also organized under the Indian Reorganization Act, but more importantly, the traditional governance for Akwesasne has always been the Longhouse. And so out of this, there's this very rich political activism, but also highly charged politics going between two different countries, two different provinces, as well as the state of New York. So Richard Oakes grew up in a very magnetic community as far as understanding his place as well as his nation's sovereignty in the larger sense of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So where this story really picks up for Richard Oakes is we start with a sister community, or another Mohawk community, that's located across from Montreal, which is Ganawage Reserve, which you can see here on the map. Now, the story picks up in 1851. And the reason being is that in the 1850s, Montreal as a city was looking to basically bring in a lot of goods from the United States. And to do so, they wanted to bypass shipping through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to build a bridge going straight across Ganawage land into the United States to be able to ship goods a lot faster. To do so, they were going to need to build a bridge. So they go to the Ganawage Council. They asked at least the leaders at Ganawage if they could build this timber frame construction bridge, a railroad bridge. And the leaders at Ganawage said, that would be just fine, but you have to hire all Mohawks to build this bridge. And in the process of that, they learned the trade of timber frame construction. Well, eventually, as technology change, industrial revolution begins to occur, especially in the later part of the 19th century, timber frame construction was then replaced with iron and ironworking. And of course, Mohawks became an integral force, as well as other Haudenosaunee peoples, in the ironworking labor force. And pretty soon, they would recruit at least members from their sister community at Akwesasne into this very highly charged industry, which was seeing a lot of work and a lot of building in one of the world's most famous cities, which is New York City. And out of this, Mohawks began at least arriving in New York and settling in Queens first in the latter part of the 19th century, and then moving gradually into Brooklyn. Now, because this talk is also sponsored by the Tenement Museum, I thought it really important to give you a photo that came out of Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Live. It's this photo that also appears in the book. And it was something that I ran into when this book was assigned to me, even as a freshman at the University of Missouri when I was in school. I saw this photo going through Riis's book and I was captivated by it, because it's one of the few photos of Native family that appear in the book itself, which is trying to document kind of the plague and the scourge that is happening in the sense of the conditions of tenement living throughout New York. And this is a photo that came from the Lower East Side around 6th Beach Street, which would later become kind of the staging grounds for the building of the World Trade Center. What's fascinating is in this photo, when taken apart, we begin to see a family that's doing a particular style of beadwork, which is that raised beadwork. The whole family is involved with it. One of the children is playing the fiddle as well, so there's music in the home, which is very unique in this time period, especially in a book that's all to talk about dilapidation, right? The scourge of tenement living. We actually see a very happy family with some material items, with space, with wallpaper, with a window. And out of this, we get a different picture of Native peoples indigenizing the city that they live in. We can also kind of take this photo apart in many different ways and investigate why Mohawks are also in New York City at this time. One is through the playing of lacrosse, which is another main vehicle that is a Haudenosaunee tradition. But also a lot of the Mohawks are playing in New York in league tournaments, but also participating in Wild West shows that are going all around the world and traveling, which if you look at the trunk that the individual who's named here Mountain Eagle, which is probably a stage name that was given to Jacob Riis, he's sitting on a trunk, which is a traveling trunk. And you can see at least a travel ticket stapled to that trunk to see the number of times that the family has traveled. And he's probably selling the beadwork that they're doing at local shows to basically raise money for his family and the course of living. So it's really fascinating to understand that Mohawk people, but especially Native peoples, have been in New York City for hundreds and thousands of years and are the backbone to this city. And we'll go into this in further detail. Now, one of the big articles that came out about Mohawks being in the city, which Mohawks will typically move then from Queens into Brooklyn by the 19-teens, 1920s, around the Gowanus Red Hook district, which I'll put up a map here in just a second. But they were captivated, at least people were captivated by the large number of Mohawks moving into the community to work in the iron industry. And part of the reason to move to Brooklyn is that Brooklyn was located really close to Manhattan. It was cheaper. It was easier to get into Manhattan to be able to kind of do the iron work that was needed during the course of the day. Plus, the local Ironworkers Union 391 was located right there in Brooklyn, and they could take a commanding force in the Union as well. Now, this is a National Geographic article that came out in 1952 called Mohawk Scrape the Sky. And what's fascinating is reporters in these, in kind of uncovering this Mohawk city in the early years, would attribute kind of superhuman abilities to Mohawks doing this ironworking. And they would pretty much just say, well, they're native, so they have no fear of height. They have absolute wonderful skills of balance and dexterity because of their nativeness. And out of this, when I started interviewing ironworkers, they basically just said, no, that's not true. All of us were very afraid to work in this industry. But the industry is important because what the industry is it opened a window where in the rest of the city and in the rest of America, where we face rampant discrimination in the sense of being able to find employment, ironworking was such a dangerous occupation that very few people would sign up for it. And Haudenosaunee peoples began to sign up for it in droves because there was no discrimination. As long as you're willing to work 60 to 80 stories up without a safety net, without a harness, and building these massive structures that became the modernization of America and one of the most famous skylines in the world, you would actually get paid and you'd be able to have a job. So out of this, Richard Oakes' family really gets involved in the ironworking industry. It starts with his father, it starts with his uncles. And of course, these are some photos of that. And he starts with, Richard Oakes gets into the industry at the age of 16. Part of this is that he really wanted to get to know his dad a lot better. Arthur Oakes served during World War II. He was a Mohawk code talker. A lot of the Oakes family, Levi Oakes, Alex Oakes, they were all code talkers. Arthur Oakes was actually on the boat for the D-Day invasion. So he was probably one receiving the messages and transcribing those messages to basically give us the key advantage in being successful in the D-Day invasion. So if you look at the photo in the top right, this is a photo of Arthur Oakes. He's on the very far right. This is a photo of him standing on the 110th story of the World Trade Center as it was being built. And so Arthur Oakes actually worked on the North Tower. His brother Leonard Oakes would actually work on the South Tower in building the World Trade Center. And he's at least next to several members from Ganawage that are standing right next to him. Now, in the early years of building, all the way up into the 1960s, ironworkers were using a riveting process, and they were known as riveting gangs. And so you'd work in great gangs of 4. And there's a really famous story when I interviewed Dean Chavers, who was one of the mainland coordinators for the Alcatraz takeover. He mentioned going over to Richard Oakes' apartment one day, and Richard Oakes was changing clothes, and he saw Richard take his shirt off, and Richard had all these scars on his chest. He asked me, he's like, man, what is that? What happened to you? And he's like, oh, I was an iron worker, and I worked in a riveting gang. And you know, Dean kind of looked baffled at him. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, how did they do that to you in this industry? He said, well, it's no big deal. We were, I was a catcher on this riveting gang. And what that meant is the guy that you see up in the top left has this wheelbarrow full of hot coals, and he heats up these rivets that look like kind of a mushroom, and they get red hot. And then another guy will take that and throw the rivet down. And there's a guy who has this kind of long cylinder can, and he's the catcher. And this is what Richard would do. And you would catch those hot rivets, and then you would place them into the beam, which you can see in that bottom right photo. And you would put them into the beam. And then the other guy on the other end had a pneumatic hammer that would pound and taper the other end. So it kind of button those beams together. And then, of course, when that red hot rivet would cool, all the air would be taken out of it, and it would seal that beam in that joint. So all these buildings, from Rockefeller Center to the Chrysler Building, all of these famous buildings, the Empire State Building, were built by Mohawk hands. That city was built by Mohawk ingenuity. Mohawks would comprise, at least by the 1930s and 40s, it would comprise ultimately 15% of the ironworking labor force of New York City. And of course, Richard really wanted to understand this industry. His father was a part of it. His father and mother also split up when he was a young man. So they divorced shortly after he returned back from World War II. And out of this, Irene had to put the kids in an orphanage. She would work for a number of years, working 2 jobs in New York, working as a Rosie the Riveter, working in the war industry, and then later working for a tool and die factory in order to be able to support her kids and eventually buy them a house for them to live in. So because their dad was absent for so long, this is why Richard at the age of 16 would drop out and of course join the ironworking industry to get to know his dad. Now, if you go to Ganawage, right before you enter the Ganawage community in outside of Montreal, there is this giant sign that's spray painted underneath at least the bridge that you pass under. And it's to showcase the pride, this kind of nationalism that's a part of the ironworking industry and tradition for Mohawk peoples and Haudenosaunee peoples in general. So this is give you a kind of a map of Brooklyn, and that kind of section that is highlighted there is the Guanason Red Hook district. So the state streets of Pacific, as well as looking at Boyd Avenue, Hoyt Street, all of these happen to be a part of this larger Mohawk neighborhood that Richard Oakes found himself living and growing up in. And also going back to and forth to Akwesasne, like a lot of kids did in the summertime. Now, his home happened to be in South Slope neighborhood, which this is a photo of his home. It took me a while to track it down. And I remember taking the photo and several people were staring at me like, why is this guy in the neighborhood taking photos of houses? And I was just, the biggest nerd having found this house. I remember taking the photo to Richard Oakes' brother, Leonard, up at Akwesasne, and he said, yes, that is our house. That our mother got for us. And of course, on that second story there, as you can see, that was the bedroom for Richard and Leonard Oakes growing up in the home. And the photo that you see to the right is probably the most impactful person on Richard Oakes' life. And that was his mother, Irene Foote. And so Irene is in the background holding one of the cousins on her lap. And then of course, Richard Oakes, a young Richard Oakes, is right up front with his brother Leonard behind them. And they grew up in Brooklyn. They played stickball like other kids. They got involved at the YMCA, but there was also institutions that were wholeheartedly Mohawk institutions that were indigenizing the city during this time period. One of those is Collier's First Presbyterian Church. And Dr. David Corey came in and he was realizing his pews weren't really filling up. And he was really having trouble getting patrons to come to his church. And then he was walking the streets and he heard this language he'd never heard before. It was a Mohawk language. And he asked them, what language is this? And they told him, yeah, it's Mohawk language. There's tons of Mohawks around. We work in the ironworking industry. He eventually would get a hymnal and he would translate that hymnal into Mohawk language and he'd begin learning the language himself to where he could hold sermons in the language, where songs were being sung in the language. Now, the fascinating thing is a lot of Ganawage Mohawks, as well as Six Nations, as well as Akwesasne, there's a lot of Catholics, at least because the Catholic Church was a part of reservation life and community for a number of years. It is interesting that they started going to the Presbyterian Church, mainly because you can hear the language and the language is being spoken, as these pictures from that same National Geographic article attest to. David Corey was also indigenized in this process. He would go on to write one of the first urban Indian histories in the 1950s called Within Two Worlds that would be published in that time period. Another institution of the Mohawk City that I talk a lot about in the book is the Indian bars. And one of the biggest bars for at least the neighborhood was not only the Dore Tavern, but also the Wigwam Bar, which was run by two Ganawage Mohawks, a couple. And it was a famous bar because they could get at least this Montreal ale that was kind of famous at Ganawage in the homelands. They could have it there, at least at the Wigwam. And when you walked into the Wigwam Bar, you knew it was an ironworking bar, because a sign hung over the entrance to the bar that said "Home to the world's greatest ironworkers," When you walked in, you saw posters of Jim Thorpe. You saw posters of Sitting Bull. Behind the bar, you saw the Gustoy. You saw the helmets or the hard hats of those who had fallen and had met their death. And it was a place of prominence. And the community would come together. Anytime somebody would lose their lives in the community, and that bar was silent, you knew somebody had passed. Somebody had lost their lives in the ironworking industry. But the community would always come together, and they would take a collection fund. And the collection fund was taken to the Wigwam bar, and then it was given to the family who had lost their loved one in the industry to be able to help them out. It was also the place where you found jobs. I mean, if you were a new young Mohawk coming into the city trying to find your way, or trying to find, where am I going to find a place to live? Does anybody have an extra room? Where can I get on in an ironworking gang? The bars was the place to go. The Indian bars were the place to go to find those jobs, to find the community. Now, Cantonita Horn, who's a famous Red Power activist, even from the 1960s, who was from Ganawage, grew up in Brooklyn as well. She said, it was better than watching Ozzie and Harriet. You would hang out at least on the stoop, and you would watch at least what was going on at the Wigwam, and it made for the greatest entertainment in the world, because you could hear the language being spoken. You could see people dancing. You could see people joking and carrying on. And of course, the hardest part for the kids, as she would say, was when your parents asked you or your mom to go fetch your father from the bar to come back home from dinner. But it was an enjoyable community. Of course, they'd also, indigenize the city even further. Local grocery stores would begin carrying foods that were staple foods for the Mohawk community. So out of this, Brooklyn became indigenized. It became a largely Mohawk community. Now, Richard Oakes would eventually be working on a bridge in Rhode Island, and he would decide that he wanted to learn a little bit more about Indigenous history, but it was a time for a change. And like many Americans, he wanted to head west. And more importantly, he wanted to head to one particular city, San Francisco, which was caught in the summer of love. And San Francisco was a place where everything was beginning to change. Everything was beginning to happen in the sense of progressive movements. And Richard Oakes wanted to be a part of that. The thing about it was that most people conceive of San Francisco as being this kind of 1960s city, that there was patchouli and beads somehow on every street corner, and that every street in San Francisco looked like Haight and Ashbury. That's not true. Richard Oakes actually wound up in the Mission District of San Francisco. And he had an ironic first job when he would arrive in San Francisco. His first job was actually as a truck driver. And the reason why that was ironic is that he was arrested at a very young age because he got involved with a gang. But that gang was in Syracuse, New York, and they saw this meat truck that was basically left running as the person was making a delivery. And they decided they would steal the meat truck and drive it down to Onondaga, to the reservation there outside of Syracuse, and hand out free meat to everybody on the res. So when the cops showed up, Richard's friends were in the front of the truck. They saw the cops, they dispersed. But Richard was left in the back of the truck handing out meat to people, and he was caught red-handed. He was then sent to Elmira Reformatory School in Comstock as well. And eventually, he, when in San Francisco, decided to be a truck driver. Which is kind of ironic. He didn't choose ironworking, but chose an occupation that he was arrested for. Eventually, he would find a new job, and that was at Warren's Slaughterhouse Bar. Warren's was the Indian bar of San Francisco. It was located 2 storefronts down from the Indian Center in San Francisco. And there was 2 things that was really kind of happening that was electrifying one of the greatest migrations in Native history into the cities during this time period. The first of those was World War II. Thousands of Native peoples worked in the wartime industries, especially in San Francisco and in New York as well, working at least for the wartime industry. And then the second thing that would happen was the relocation program. And the relocation program was started by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a way to try to increase the assimilation and acculturation of Native peoples. And what the program was meant to do was to remove us to one of 6 cities, San Francisco being one of those cities. And in the process, what would happen is that we would somehow be a part of this melting pot experiment, being in these cities. We were supposed to be given a job. We were supposed to be giving us an allowance to be able to buy housewares and groceries. And we were supposed to be given a place to live as well. And what most people found when they moved on relocation, which was voluntary, a lot of these things were missing. The government didn't come through, at least on its services. And they had to build institutions that would support these large Native populations that were now moving to the city. Approximately 1 in 7 Native peoples would move during the relocation program, which would go from 1948 all the way up into the 1970s. And of course, out of this, it meant that there was over 30,000 people that were living in San Francisco during this time period, making it one of the more populous of Native cities. In fact, over half of our population in Indian country were living in US cities by 1970. So Richard didn't enter into Haight-Ashbury. He entered into a very lively Indian city, which had its own institutions. Warren's bar was fascinating because it was the meeting place. It's what he knew, even like the wigwam or the dore in tavern within at least Brooklyn. It made sense to him. But he also was able to talk more about politics. In fact, Warren's Slaughterhouse Bar was the first place that future American Indian Movement leader Russell Means would say was the first place he learned about termination. And termination was another thing that was affecting Native peoples. In 1953, they created the House Concurrent Resolution 108, which was to terminate Native nations legislatively. And over 109 Native nations would be terminated in that time period from 1953 up until 1970. So very serious issues affecting Indian country. Not only are they trying to terminate your individual link with your Native community, but they're also trying to terminate our tribes, trying to terminate our tribal governance and our sovereignty, all within that time period. Well, out of this, San Francisco is a highly charged community. As I said, there's Indian bars like Warren's Slaughterhouse Bar. There was over 450 Indian-owned businesses. The advent of Native studies happens in 1969, creating another institution of the city. There was a very vibrant powwow culture in the city with large trade in Native arts and trades and that were going throughout San Francisco that would be sold oftentimes at powwows in the city. There was Native churches like the Native American Church, the Indian Baptist Church. Several organizations and clubs were sponsored, as well as media like radio shows and newspapers, as well as academic journals sponsored by the Native community there in San Francisco. This is give you a picture of the Indian Center, which was there on 16th Street in Valencia. And the story takes place an interesting turn because Richard would meet his future wife, Annie Oakes, at an anti-war rally, an anti-Vietnam rally in San Francisco. And they would quickly fall in love. And she had several kids from a previous marriage, 5 kids from a previous marriage that were younger. And those kids became Richard's kids. He loved those kids. And of course, he could keep an eye on them because the bar where he was working was just 2 storefronts down. And the kids would go to the Indian Center after school. And they would receive tutoring help from students attending San Francisco State Community or San Francisco State College that were tutoring kids at the Indian Center, oftentimes every day. This is how they would get to know Richard Oakes. And slowly but surely, something else happened at San Francisco State that would change Richard's life forever. San Francisco State was caught up in the largest college campus riots in our nation's history. In which the students basically were advocating for the creation of ethnic studies. They wanted their courses to look like the rest of what their environments look like. They wanted Black studies and Chicano studies and Latinx studies and Native studies. So they walked out and the faculty joined them. And pretty soon they created the first ever Native American Studies course, and Richard Oakes became the coordinator of Native American Studies. This is where he would bring in White Roots of Peace Caravan into San Francisco State. So leaders like Tom Porter, a young Tom Porter, who you can see here, Peter Mitten, as well as Jerry Gamble would come in. Richard is pictured here with the Gastoe right in front of one of the belts. And so part of this was an education in Mohawk nationalism, which was to inform new strategies of resistance that would be part and parcel of the foundations of what would become the Red Power movement, and also the foundations of what would be the Alcatraz Takeover. And the Alcatraz Takeover in and of itself has a really interesting history. It starts in 1964. And in 1964, a group of Lakota take over Alcatraz. This is actually Russell Means on the very bottom left of this corner in that takeover. They would use the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, seizing this abandoned federal property as Lakota land, honoring at least that treaty. The occupation lasted all of about an hour. The person that would be instrumental in this is Bellecourtier, who you can see kind of right behind Russell Means there, helping to hold up the US flag. Bellecourtier did the legal research for this occupation, and Richard Oakes would hire her as a community liaison for Native American Studies as its first ever coordinator. And pretty soon she was telling stories about the 1964 takeover. It only lasted an hour, but it captured something of a symbol, and it captured something more because the media all around the country were drawn to this occupation. It was a way to get the media to pay attention to Indigenous rights at a time in which we were still invisible in this country. So the students at San Francisco State were also really in communication with students also at Berkeley. And at Berkeley, the students there were led by a Shoshone Bannock by the name of Lenata Means, who is from the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho. She had moved to San Francisco on relocation. She also took over an abandoned piece of property on the Berkeley campus and made the American Indian House at Berkeley to start Native studies there as well. And the students at San Francisco State and Berkeley would take a teach-in course that was sponsored by a Native historian by the name of Jack Forbes, who was teaching at the Far West Laboratory. And at night, he would bring in leaders from NIYC and other Native movements to begin discussing what is Native activism, what is direct action. And the students came up with an ultimate plan to make a change in Indian country forever. They would attempt a takeover of Alcatraz Island in November of 1969. Now, one of the first attempts occurs on early part of November of 1969, on November 14th, November 9th of 1969. The students gather down by the docks, and Richard's reading the proclamation. He actually holds out strips of red cloth and beads and offers to purchase Alcatraz Island for $28 in beads and cloth, mimicking the purchase of Manhattan Island some 300 years ago. And the reporters are eating all of this up. The problem is they don't have a boat to get to the island, so they're afraid of losing momentum. They find this guy, Ronald Craig, who has this triple-masted ship called the Endeavor, which is a mock of James Cook's famous ship, who was the explorer in the Pacific for the British. And they go to this Ronald Craig and they ask, "Can you take us to the island?" And Craig's like, sees all the reporters. He's thinking, this could be really good press for the boat. Sure, why not? So everybody jumps on the boat. He begins sailing out towards at least Alcatraz Island. He fires the cannon, which gets the crowd rip-roaring. Richard Oakes, though, goes to the front of the boat. And he basically takes his shirt off. He looks back at the crowd and he says, "Come on, let's go. Let's get it on." Takes his shirt off, jumps from the boat into the frigid waters of the bay, which differs in 1 degree in temperature. I mean, there's a reason there's a federal penitentiary built on Alcatraz. You're not supposed to swim to it. You're not supposed to swim away from it. It's incredibly dangerous. But he swims all 250 yards, making his way to the island, pulling himself up, and the crowd goes nuts. Now, he's taken off at least the island relatively quickly, but it's a symbol of self-determination. Where the boat wouldn't take us, he would take us there himself, in a symbolic action of this takeover. Later that night, they would go and take over the island, kind of a scouting mission, in which they were able to see the resources that were there on the island. They would be taken off early that next morning. And then Richard would travel up and down the state of California, speaking at college campuses. And pretty soon they would get a D-Day invasion together. Where his dad was leading the D-Day invasion, Richard Oakes was leading a new D-Day invasion for Indigenous rights on Alcatraz Island. They would take over Alcatraz November 20th, 1969, in the early morning hours at 2 a.m. And they would build a new community on Alcatraz, and it would capture worldwide attention. And Alcatraz was a perfect symbol because it represented the federal government's failed responsibility to honor treaty rights. It represented a place with no running water, no electricity. It represented a place with no industry, no employment. So it was the perfect metaphor for American Indian reservations all across the United States. And this was one way they could educate the public about Indigenous rights. And they were highly organized on the island. So this is one of the more famous of photos. This is the only known staged photo that took place during this 19-month occupation that would go from November 20th all the way up until June 11th of 1971. So this would appear in Look magazine. You can see Richard Oakes front and center. To his right is Annie Oakes, his wife, and then right next to him is John Trudell holding a young Tara Trudell. And then to Richard Oakes' left is Stella Leach. And reason why this is important photo is that this was an unarmed occupation. This was a nonviolent occupation. This was an occupation by students. This is an occupation by families. This is an occupation that was led by Native men and women together. This was our community taking back and liberating Indian country and showing the rest of the world how to do it. It's showing the rest of Indian country, as well as the Western Hemisphere, what Indigenous rights needed to be honored. So out of this, reporters flood to the island. These are some very rare photos. We can go into these in the Q&A at a later point. Richard Oakes reading the proclamation. These photos were on the first day as well as the 25th, but they also got celebrities there to the island. This is Aidan Quinn, who is in a movie called Flap, who comes to the island. And publications like Good Housekeeping, right? The publication, which is the cult of domesticity, is covering Red Power. This is how pervasive this movement is and how impactful this movement is on educating at least people that once considered us to be invisible. Now they were seeing us for the first time. Other movements were also involved in this. There was a great effort at coalition politics, working with the Brown Berets, the Black Panther Party. Indians of all tribes would march in the Moratorium March in East LA in the early part of the 1970s. And you can see the banner of Indians of all tribes marching in this. Brown Berets would later take over Catalina Island outside of Los Angeles in an attempt to be like an Alcatraz-like takeover. So they were making inroads with other organizations. The Black Panther Party was also finding ties with their own indigeneity through their discussions and through involvement with the indigenous community in San Francisco and in Oakland, where the Black Panther Party was headquartered and centered. But out of this, they were able to ship supplies in. They were able to build schools on the island. They were able to build a newsletter that would be shipped out around the country. And of course, they would also stage Radio Free Alcatraz, which was a syndicated radio station that would also broadcast in New York City during the height of the occupation. Richard also would bring his kids with him. And so this is a picture of Annie Oakes on the island. This is Yvonne Oakes. Her hair had been cut shorter in the background. And then, of course, Leonard and Tanya Oakes standing next to him. Now, despite all this organizing, despite all this momentum for Indigenous rights in this time period with this symbol of Alcatraz, in which over 10,000 Native people would make their way to Alcatraz Island during the course of this occupation, tragedy would happen. Yvonne Oakes, who was 12 years old at the time, would fall from the third stairwell of the Ira Hayes building on Alcatraz Island. And then several days later, she would die in a San Francisco hospital. And at that point, Richard Oakes basically said, enough is enough, and it left the island. But enough wasn't enough, because one of his most famous quotes was, "Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea." In other words, what was happening at Alcatraz could happen all across this country, as hundreds of other occupations were basically following suit in copycat fashion like Alcatraz. And there was a takeover of Wrigley Field in Chicago. There was an attempted takeover of Ellis Island in New York City. And of course, Richard knew that you could package the strategy, the tactics of Alcatraz and transport them to other places. This is a picture of Radio Free Alcatraz with John Trudell and Grace Thorpe being interviewed by him for that radio show. It's a picture of some of the newsletters and, of course, a lot of the political statements that would be covered over the island itself, indigenizing the island, decolonizing this former prison, right? So very powerful symbols were created. He would then lead a takeover of the BIA in Sacramento, which was one of the first BIA takeovers, was led by Richard Oakes. And here he is with a group of 12 students being led out of that building. He would then, in March of 1970, go straight up to Seattle, where he was involved in Fission's protests, sponsored by the Survival of American Indians Association. And of course, during this time period, the community there had made notice that there was a military base called Fort Lawton that was going as surplus property. It would take 3 attempts, and Richard Oakes was a part of that second attempt, a major attempt. It'd take 3 attempts before Fort Lawton, a military base, would be turned over to the Indian community in Seattle. And today, that is known as the Daybreak Star Indian Center. One of the more famous of this was that second time when Richard Oakes was there, because Jane Fonda was also supposed to be involved in this takeover, in which they had an encampment outside of the fort, and then they decided to rush into the fort, jumping over the fence lines, racing away from the MPs in all different directions. The problem was Jane Fonda went to Fort Lewis, not Fort Lawton. So while we were getting our heads cracked in and the media was not there, they were covering her arrest at Fort Lewis instead. So she holds a press conference later that night to give more attention to this cause, which would actually be successful. So despite the arrests, despite the beatings that people were enduring in the fighting for this liberation that was taking place, they were meeting mass success. Alcatraz looked like it was also going to gain title during this time period as well. And so Richard Oakes takes that success up to Pitt River Nation in Northern California, which they'd had over 3.5 million acres of land in Northern California, and they never ceded this land. The government tried to offer them 47 cents an acre. They refused. But in the process of this, multinational corporations had moved onto the land and were taking resources. Corporations like Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which has been in the news even relatively recently. But they were taking resources without giving anything back to the tribe. And they began to say, how can we use similar tactics of Alcatraz to liberate our lands, but also put this in front of the courts? So they then did just that. They went to campgrounds at PG&E and they got arrested. And the part of the issue was that when getting arrested, they wanted to be charged with trespass, and they were happy. The cops were like, "Why are you happy being charged with trespass?" They're like, "You just made our case for us." Because when you're charged with trespass in a court of law, you've got to prove that you have actual title to that land. And Pitt River knew they did. And sure enough, that's exactly what the courts decided. PG&E did not have proper title to those lands. So you can imagine the rush the shareholders are going to have on this corporation if all of a sudden their stock is basically being held by the tribe itself. Out of this, Richard Oakes would then go into the city, would try to serve a citizen's arrest on the head of PG&E Corporation. He was beaten within an inch of his life. It would be Peter Mitten, who's pictured here as Cayuga alongside of Mad Bear Anderson. They would use native medicine, and they would doctor him back to health, in which he would have to learn to walk again, learn to talk again, learn to speak again. And the first thing he did after he got out of the hospital was he went to an anti-war rally. He never gave up on the idea. He never gave up on the ideology that was started that day at Alcatraz. In fact, this is a picture of Richard Oakes at the later court trials for Pitt River. And that's Shermer Sibley, who's the president of PG&E, getting up as Richard approaches him with a sign protesting at least PG&E being illegally on Pitt River lands. By 1972, he'd moved to his wife's reservation at Kashaya Pomo, and this is a picture of Michael Oliver Morgan. Morgan happened to be a YMCA day camp director. He had 2 prior attempts on Richard Oakes' life, in which the day camp was located just off of Kashaya Reservation. On the 3rd attempt, in September of 1972, Richard was walking down Skag Springs Road. He was going to meet a California Indian legal attorney to discuss how this YMCA day camp was on Kashaya lands. And in the process of this, word got back to Michael Morgan. He took a loaded Welder P38 9mm gun. He stuck it down his pants. He walked down towards the road, and then he pulled the gun and he would fire 1 round. And that 1 round would go right straight through Richard's heart. Cops would show up. He was arrested right away with first-degree murder. Within 1 hour after his arrest, those charges were dropped to just a manslaughter charge of voluntary manslaughter, because he said that it was self-defense, even though Richard Oakes was unarmed, even though he could have outrun Richard Oakes, remember, suffered from paralysis on half of his body. And so out of this, Michael Morgan then is put before a court of law in 1973 or 72. He was eventually found not guilty in a Northern California court of law in killing Richard Oakes. Now, later that day, Richard Oakes had they put a tarp over his body after he'd been shot. Annie Oakes had been off of Kashaya. She'd been shopping for groceries, and she was driving back with a friend, and they saw this crowd gathered on the side of the road, and they noticed, cop cars everywhere in this crowd, and then there was a tarp and a body maybe, and they get a little bit past that, about 10 feet past this crowd, and her friend says to her, "Oh my gosh, are those Richard's boots?" Annie slams the brakes. She jumps out of the car. She runs over, she pulls the tarp back to find her knight in shining armor. She to find the love of her life had been taken away from her. And the problem is no justice was ever given for the assassin, which was Michael Oliver Morgan. Out of this, it would cause Hank Adams to say we need a march on Washington. In 1972, they organized the Trail of Broken Treaties March on Washington, in which they would take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, the first time since the War of 1812 that a building in Washington, D.C. had been taken over by another power. And then the process of this would usher in a new call for self-determination. I mean, shortly after Alcatraz, people have to remember Richard Nixon would give over Taos Blue Lake back to Taos Pueblo. He would end relocation as a policy with the BIA. He would end termination. And he would start the passage of what would then be 26 pieces of self-determination legislation, like the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, as well as other legislation and another 29 Supreme Court cases that would confirm Indigenous rights. All of this would not have happened if it wasn't for this movement. All of this would not have happened if Richard Oakes didn't risk everything and put his body on the line for change. So out of this, I typically like to say at the end of this, where would we be, if we didn't know this story? And for the last 50 years, we've not known this story because this is the first time it has been written. So I oftentimes poll my classes and I ask them, how many of you know who Richard Oakes is? Not a student will raise their hands. And it's hard because it talks to the lack of curriculum that we have in our K through 12 school district. Oftentimes what I have to say is, what if we didn't know the names Malcolm X? What if we didn't know the names Martin Luther King or Dolores Huerta or Cesar Chavez? Why don't we know the name Richard Oakes? Anyway, thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm looking forward to your questions and really appreciate the chance to be able to share this story. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So many emotions. I'm Mohawk. Richard Oakes is my family. He's my kin. So in the beginning, like the whole Mohawk nationalism and just the pride and just like going through that journey, like about the iron workers, because I grew up, my grandparents, my uncles, my cousins, all iron workers, my neighbors. It's just beautiful to hear everything told in one sitting. But then when you got around to the end, then, that's where the pain comes from, which happens so often where there's no justice. So I found myself crying a little bit, but it's like the end of every story for us. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for doing this work. I think it's really important because, like you said, this is a story that's missing from history. He should be lined right up with Malcolm X and other big names of that sort in like activist movements such as this. But most often as Ungwehunwe, as the original people of this land, were erased. So for you to do this work, just personally, I'm grateful for, just people listening now, but also for my kids. There's this book to reference. There's, this work that they can learn about, their family, who they wouldn't otherwise, I didn't have all of this information to pass down to them. But yeah, so I think my one question is, what brought you to do his biography? How did you get there? How did this happen?
That's a great question, and thank you very much for speaking from the heart. That touches me as well. That this can have reverberations for family members as well. And his story is so vital to understanding our modern experience as Indigenous peoples. I got started with this when I was doing activism at the University of Missouri. I was one out of 25 Native students, and we got involved in the repatriation movement, which the university had about 3,000 of our ancestors that they were keeping in boxes for experimentation. And so I started working with the American Indian movement at that point and led a 4-year movement to try to get those ancestors sent back home. And in the process of that, I began reading voraciously anything I could find on Red Power. And I remember reading, about Alcatraz, and I remember seeing Richard's name associated with it. But the problem was, people had written about Richard before is, they knew he was an ironworker, they knew he was a Mohawk from New York, but there was nothing about his early years. There was nothing about his growing up. And then they would say a little bit about Alcatraz. Oftentimes they would make Alcatraz a failure, which I have major problems and I take to task with in this book, because it's absolutely one of the most successful social justice movements in this country's history. And so that's my other kind of segue with it. But I began thinking, I want to know more about who Richard Oakes is, because people just haven't written enough about him. And after Alcatraz, there's nothing. They just say he's murdered or he dies, but it was really just a mystery to me. Then I got into doing my master's at the University of New Mexico. And I took a course from Frank Saz that was on biography. And in the course of that, they asked, who do you want to write about? And whoever it is that you want to write about, it should be a person that you want to know more about instantly. And right when he asked that, it was Richard Oakes for me. And that started me on an 18-year odyssey to begin trying to uncover anything and everything I could find, on Richard Oakes' life. And it's not an easy story to tell. It's a really difficult story to tell. And for a number of reasons. But it's also a story that is uplifting. It's not a story of declension. It's not a story of victimization. It's also a story of survivance. It's a story of empowerment. And I think that's his legacy, to empower and inspire future generations. It's why Google Doodle will make a Google Doodle out of Richard Oakes on his birthday back in 2017. It is why the San Francisco State University will dedicate its multicultural center to the name of Richard Oakes. So it's interesting to see more momentum of this. San Francisco on November 20th, which we were talking about right before this, every year, the mayor of San Francisco dedicated November 20th to always being Richard Oakes Day in San Francisco, so that his memory would forever be honored. So I hope that what this book can do is kind of begin that question and educating others about Indigenous rights, but hopefully, maybe, get justice for Richard as well, in the sense of finding justice after all these years of being denied that, in the sense of his assassination.
Thank you. There's a couple of comments here. I'll share a couple of them, and we can just talk about them more. Somebody wrote, I am curious about indigenizing the city and how those communities have weathered time. And another comment is, I remember the Alcatraz takeover, but that's it. What is happening now? How has this progressed? Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking about, the question about the city and the communities, and just about, I have to say Ngwehue. I don't say Indigenous, I say Ngwehue. How Ngwehue, who were relocated, how they're doing in cities, just based off of my experience in New York City. I kind of got a feel of what's happening down in San Francisco by the Mission area. It's not as lively as it once was. I was at the 50-year anniversary a year and a half ago to celebrate Alcatraz and Richard. And me and maybe like a few other Mohawks made our way there, and wasn't the friendliest situation for us, but with change of this, this magnitude, it's, always sort of like a rough situation. Either way, I know that it's rough in cities, is what I'm trying to say. Just being the executive director of the American Indian Community House, it's not easy in cities. And on top of it all, out of our entire population on Turtle Island, about 70% of Native Americans are located in urban cities. So I don't know if you want to add anything more about San Francisco and how they're doing now.
Yeah, in Brooklyn's fascinating because, once interstates get built, once, the highways start, charging up, people can commute. They don't have to live in Brooklyn. So people will begin going and moving back to Ganawage, begin moving back to Akwesasne. There was one slide I showed Hank's Saloon. That's one of the places where a lot of iron workers, or at least Haudenosaunee iron workers, hang out within the city still. But then, it's as I say, there's still a presence. We would see this change right around the 1960s, 1970s. Much like when Richard was leaving to go to San Francisco, we begin to also see that change in where people begin living back at home or living back at Akwesasne. But his father and his brother continue working. I mean, like I said, they worked on the World Trade Center together. Leonard was on the South Tower, his dad was on the North Tower. And they stayed in contact with Richard throughout that time. San Francisco, much the same. The Indian Center burns down in 1969. They're still working to get a new Indian Center built or community center in San Francisco. So this has gained momentum, which has been fun to kind of be a part of that project. It's also fun to see that the National Park Service on Alcatraz Island has been honoring the story, even more so of the takeover and the occupation, in which, it's second to that of the Statue of Liberty as the most populated urban park in the country. Over 5 million people a year go out to Alcatraz Island. So when they go out to Alcatraz Island, they're basically learning about Indigenous rights. So another reason why this takeover is so successful is it's still educating people about Indigenous rights even to this day. So out of this, the city of San Francisco, the population is still rather large, stretching between San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland. It's very dispersed as well, but there's still several of those institutions. Native Studies is still going strong, as you could see at San Francisco State from that previous slide. Out of this, though, what was the second question that you had?
It was just how has this progressed after that movement?
Good question too. I mean, so essentially out of this, you had the BIE takeover in 1972. Nixon will get out of that by just paying cash. It's an election year, so he gives about $60,000 in cash to the activists to leave the city so he can get rid of the bad press. This will lead the American Indian movement eventually for the takeover of Wounded Knee in 1973, which will be a 71-day siege. 1975 is where we get the killing of Agents Kohler and Williams. This is after a reign of terror has ran through on the Pine Ridge Reservation, in which hundreds of people lose their lives in this reign of terror that's government sponsored. Even after, as part of the legacy of Wounded Knee. We lose activists like Anime Pictou Aquash in this process. We lose Frank Clearwater, Buddy Lamont, and several others. And then, of course, one of the largest manhunts in history happens with the arrest of Leonard Peltier, who is innocent, but is still serving multiple life sentences. And you can kind of look up that story. That will eventually get us into the 1980s with the Yellow Thunder camps in the Black Hills, in which liberation theology is still very alive and well. And of course, the Lakota trying to make and assert their claim over the Black Hills, which they've never given up. Also fighting against uranium mining. There was Women of All Red Nations. So women's movements are also targeting and spinning up in this time period, being led by those like Madonna Thunderhawk and others to talk about women's rights and, more importantly, reproductive rights, the issues of sterilization that was affecting Native women throughout Native North America. And then, of course, by the time we get into the 1990s is the repatriation movement. By the time we get into the 2000s, we then start to see the Idle No More movement. And then Idle No More movement coming in through First Nations will eventually impact Oak Flat, will impact Standing Rock in 2016, which 2016, it was funny as an Alcatraz historian, a lot of reporters were like, it's the first time Native peoples have organized. And I had to laugh at that because I'm like, no, we've been organizing since 1492. It's just, people failed to understand that history. So Mauna Kea is another development. There's a global indigenous movement that is sponsored out of this as well, which has ramifications in 400 million indigenous peoples around the world that still see Alcatraz as a symbol of liberation and native rights. So this transcends borders is the best way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And you're absolutely right. And that's why I have you here today, is just to let people know about, the roots of our activism throughout the ages, because it didn't just start, 10, 15 years ago. But we've only got about a minute left. Somebody just asked, I'm curious about Annie Oakes and their children after the assassination. If you just want to quickly share about them.
Very quickly, Annie tries to protect the kids, so she doesn't give any interviews. Annie will eventually pass away in 2010 to cancer. I wasn't able to interview her before then. We tried, but I couldn't make it out to the hospital in time to be able to do those interviews. Several of the kids have survived from this. And so the Oakes family is very much a part of the demonstrations on Alcatraz every year. If you have a chance, get out to the island. If you have a chance, get out to the anniversaries, as well as the sunrise ceremonies, in which they do an unthanksgiving every year on the island. So unfortunately, this year's celebrations are delayed because of COVID, but we hope to get those up and running again soon. Anyway, thank you so much for having me, for allowing me to be able to share the story. And if any of the audience or anyone has questions, feel free to look me up on Facebook or email me. I'm happy to answer those questions or carry on this conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think maybe we could just part with maybe like one last, maybe some last words from you about, maybe just encouraging the audience of
Good.
ways to rethink Thanksgiving this year. Would you have anything to share?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just did a program on Unreserved, a CBC radio station, in which we were talking about the National Day of Mourning, which happens every year in Plymouth, Massachusetts, sponsored by the Wampanoag peoples. And so out of this, it's as I say, we have a chance to make change. And where we can start to make change and where I want to encourage people to be true activists is calling upon their educational systems, especially their K through 12 systems, to encourage at least more Indigenous education, more Indigenous histories in our schools. Because that's one way that we begin to start to educate people about our experiences, and we begin to change these holidays which celebrate something of our genocide, which Thanksgiving Day does, because essentially Puritan or Pilgrims were looking to commit at least war on local Wampanoag, and it was Wampanoag intervention that delayed that war, which is why we then celebrate Thanksgiving. But the impetus of this is that colonization is still ongoing. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education desegregated our schools, but the problem is it never desegregated our curriculum. And now we have a new fight. Now we have a new challenge. If we want that equality in our society as something that we value as a part of our democracy, we got to fight for it. And the schools are another way of fighting for it. So this Thanksgiving, please, think of education, think about writing, at least your representative to ask them to transform those statewide curriculum. Go out, and read more Indigenous histories, read more Indigenous literature and Indigenous authors. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right, I think that's a wrap for the night. Nyawangoa Ken and Nyawangoa, thank you very much to the Tenement Museum. And I hope everybody enjoyed learning through this session. And be sure to follow the American Indian Community House also for more programming such as this. And if you're, of the giving mind this Thanksgiving, at any point, really think about giving back to the Native American community instead of celebrating our genocide. You could visit our website at aich.org/donate, or read more about our other fundraising campaign at the Mannahatta Fund. But yes, here we are signing off. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.